17 tons of rotting tomato slurry. That was the exact weight of the corporate middle finger dumped onto Amani's lower 40. It smelled like acid and defeat. Most people would have sued. She built a 6-figure heirloom empire out of the garbage. Here is how she dug her way out. Amani Rogers rested her forehead against the cold steering wheel of her 1998 Ford. The engine ticked as it cooled. Her checking account currently held exactly $14.32. Tomorrow, the bank would call. Again. She didn't have the energy to invent a new lie about when the check for the winter squash would clear. Farming wasn't a romantic communion with the earth. It was a slow, agonizing math problem where the numbers never added up. A heavy, groaning sound pulled her from her exhaustion. She lifted her head. Down at the far end of the property, where the county road met her unplanted south pasture, a massive tandem-axle dump truck was backing up. The truck lacked a company logo, but the unmistakable stench of rotting nightshades rolling through her cracked window told her exactly where it came from. Valley Processing, the regional cannery 20 miles up the highway. Amani jammed the truck into gear and tore across the rutted dirt track, her suspension screaming. She slammed on the brakes 50 yards away, kicked her door open, and stepped into the bitter November wind. A tidal wave of red-brown sludge was sliding out the back of the raised bed. It was a gruesome mix of tomato skins, seeds, stems, and spoiled pulp. It hit the frozen earth with a wet, heavy slap. The smell was immediate and violent, a sharp, vinegary stench of fermentation mixed with rotting garbage. "Hey!" Amani screamed, waving her arms. "Cut the hydraulics! What the hell are you doing?" The driver ignored her until the bed was completely empty. A black SUV idled on the shoulder of the road. A man in a tailored wool coat stepped out. He looked entirely out of place against the grey, bleak backdrop of rural agriculture. He picked his way carefully over the frozen mud, his polished boots slipping slightly. "Miss Rogers?" he asked. He had a clipboard. He didn't look sorry. He looked inconvenienced. "Who are you, and why is there 20 tons of rotting garbage on my land?" Amani demanded. She crossed her arms, trying to suppress a shiver. Her canvas jacket was too thin for the wind. "Rafe Graham, Regional Logistics for Valley Processing." He tapped the clipboard with a silver pen. "It's not garbage. It's organic soil amendment. We're fulfilling the terms of the Community Agricultural Support Contract, signed by your late father 3 years ago. Free compost." Amani stared at the steaming pile of red sludge. "My father is dead. And that isn't compost. That's raw, unprocessed cannery waste. You're dumping it here to avoid paying the tipping fees at the commercial landfill." Rafe smiled. It was a tight, practiced expression. "I assure you, it's classified as agricultural byproduct. The contract stipulates we can deposit up to 50 tons annually on this specific parcel. It revitalizes fallow soil. It's going to turn the groundwater acidic and attract every rat in the county." Amani took a step toward him, her boots sinking into a puddle of foul-smelling red runoff. "Clean it up, now." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Rafe said smoothly. He handed her a laminated copy of a contract. There it was. Her father's shaky signature, dated months before the stroke that killed him. Her dad had always been a sucker for anything with the word "free" attached to it. The cannery lawyers had buried the dumping rights deep in the fine print of a seed purchasing agreement. "You know this is illegal," she said, her voice dropping. The fight was leaking out of her. She was so tired. "It's entirely legal. If you wish to dispute the contract, you can contact our legal department. The number is on the letterhead." Rafe turned back toward his SUV. "Have a good winter, Miss Rogers." Amani watched his taillights disappear down the highway. She stood alone in the freezing wind, accompanied only by the smell of decay. She couldn't afford a lawyer to fight a corporate cannery. She couldn't afford the diesel to scoop the mess up with her front-end loader and haul it away. She walked up to the edge of the pile. It was waist-high and spread across half an acre. The slurry was thick with millions of pale, yellowish seeds. The cannery processed millions of uniform, thick-skinned Roma tomatoes every week for ketchup and cheap pasta sauce. The waste was the inevitable byproduct of industrial efficiency. Winter came hard and early. Snow covered the pile, masking the smell and freezing the rot into a solid, jagged glacier of red ice. Amani spent the dark months working the night shift at a local hardware store, using the meager paycheck to keep the bank from foreclosing on the farmhouse. She tried to forget about the south pasture. She mentally wrote the land off. It was dead dirt now. A corporate landfill. Spring broke the frost in late April. The thaw turned the farm into a muddy swamp. Amani was behind schedule. She needed to prep her main fields for dent corn, a low-margin crop, but the only thing she had the equipment and seed credit to plant. In the second week of May, she finally took the tractor down to the south pasture. She intended to disc the decaying tomato pile deep into the soil, hoping to dilute the acidic nightmare before it permanently ruined the topsoil. She pulled up to the edge of the acreage and cut the engine. The pile wasn't a rotting mass of red sludge anymore. It was green. Amani climbed down from the cab and walked closer. Thousands upon thousands of tiny, serrated seedlings had pushed their way through the crust of decaying organic matter. The decomposing waste had actually insulated the seeds during the freeze, and the rotting pulp had acted as a highly concentrated, nutrient-dense fertilizer. The sheer density of the growth was staggering. It looked like a thick green carpet. Volunteers. That was the agricultural term for crops that grew from unplanted seeds left over from a previous harvest. But this wasn't a few rogue stalks of corn. This was a jungle. She knelt down and pulled one of the seedlings. The root structure was aggressive, thick, and healthy. She crushed a leaf between her calloused thumb and forefinger. The sharp, pungent smell of raw tomato vine hit her nose. She should plow it under. She needed the acreage. But as she sat there in the mud, looking at the fierce, stubborn will of these tiny plants, refusing to die in a pile of garbage, a dark sense of irony washed over her. "Fine," she whispered to the empty field. "You want to live so bad? Figure it out yourselves." She left them alone. It was a decision born entirely out of exhaustion and spite. She focused her remaining energy on her struggling cornfields, leaving the south pasture to the mercy of the summer heat and the weeds. July brought a brutal heatwave. The corn curled and burned. Amani spent her nights calculating how much debt she would carry over into the next year. She avoided looking at the south pasture, but by mid-August, she couldn't ignore it anymore. The weeds hadn't choked the tomatoes out. The tomatoes had choked the weeds out. The vines had exploded into a chaotic, sprawling mass of thick, hairy stems and massive yellow flowers. And then, the fruit set. Amani walked into the thicket one humid evening. She expected to see thousands of the uniform, hard, tasteless processing Romas the cannery was famous for. Instead, she stopped dead in her tracks. Hanging from the vines were monsters. They were huge, deeply lobed, and heavily ribbed. Some were blushing a deep, bruised purple. Others were streaked with violent yellow and red stripes. A few were massive, lumpy globes the color of old mahogany. She frowned, confused. These weren't industrial Romas. These were heirlooms. She reached out and snapped a heavy, purple-black tomato from a vine. It felt dense, like a water balloon about to burst. The skin was incredibly thin, too fragile for mechanical harvesting, too delicate to survive the violent sorting machines of a commercial cannery. Suddenly, it made sense. Valley Processing had tried to launch an artisanal, high-end, rustic, source line the previous year. It had been a massive failure. The delicate heirloom varieties couldn't handle the industrial equipment. They bruised, burst, and jammed the machinery. The corporate executives had likely scrapped the entire project mid-run, tossing the expensive, ruined fruit directly into the waste chute. They hadn't just dumped garbage on her land. They had dumped thousands of dollars worth of rare, high-grade heirloom seed. Amani wiped the purple tomato on her dirty jeans. She took a bite right there in the middle of the field. The juice exploded over her tongue, running down her chin and dripping onto her shirt. The flavor was a revelation. It didn't taste like the watery, mealy supermarket tomatoes she was used to. It was intensely sweet, backed by a deep, smoky acidity that tasted like sunshine and rich soil. It was, without a doubt, the best thing she had ever eaten. A quiet, terrifying spark of hope flared in her chest. Before dawn the next morning, Amani loaded 8 plastic milk crates into the bed of her Ford. She packed them carefully, laying the fragile, ugly tomatoes on beds of newspaper so they wouldn't bruise on the drive. She didn't go to the local farmer's market. People there wanted cheap, perfectly round red spheres for sandwiches. She drove 2 hours into the city, navigating the tight, trash-lined alleys behind the downtown restaurant district. She parked behind the Foundry, a high-end, farm-to-table restaurant, notorious for its impossibly high standards and its permanently exhausted executive chef. She dragged a crate out of the truck and walked up to the loading dock. A man in a stained white chef's coat was sitting on an overturned bucket, smoking a cigarette and staring blankly at a clipboard. He had dark circles under his eyes and a burned scar running up his left forearm. Teddy Marshall. He looked up as Amani dropped the crate onto the concrete dock. "Delivery window closed an hour ago," Teddy said, his voice gravelly. "And I don't buy from walk-ins." "I'm not a walk-in, I'm a farmer," Amani said. She didn't flinch. "And you want these?" Teddy sighed, took a drag of his cigarette, and looked down into the crate. He raised an eyebrow. "They're ugly. They're Cherokee purples, brandywines, and green zebras," Amani counted, guessing the varieties based on pictures she'd frantically searched on her phone the night before. Dry farmed, grown in high-acid soil. That was a nice way of saying they grew in a rotting pile of cannery waste. Teddy stood up and flicked his cigarette into the alley. He picked up a massive, misshapen purple tomato. He weighed it in his palm, feeling the density. He pulled a paring knife from his apron pocket, sliced off a wedge, and popped it into his mouth. Amani held her breath. Teddy stopped chewing. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The cynicism melted out of his posture, replaced by the sharp, intense focus of a professional who just found exactly what he didn't know he was looking for. He opened his eyes and looked at Amani. "Where did you get these?" "My lower 40, she said. "How many do you have?" Amani thought about the sprawling, chaotic jungle choking her south pasture. "Enough." Teddy pulled a wad of cash from his pocket and threw it on top of the crate. "I'll take all 8 crates today. I want 20 crates on Thursday. If the quality drops even a fraction of a percent, I cut you off. Understood?" Amani looked at the cash. It was more money than she had made off her entire corn crop the previous season. She looked back at Teddy. "You'll get them Thursday," she said. She walked back to her truck, the cash heavy in her pocket. The bank wouldn't take the farm tomorrow. The corporate giant had tried to bury her in their waste. Instead, they had handed her the seeds of her survival. And she was just getting started. August burned into September. The south pasture didn't just survive. It mutated into an uncontrollable, sprawling jungle. Harvesting commercial tomatoes is easy. A massive diesel combine straddles the row, aggressively shaking the vines, and the hard, uniform fruit bounces like rubber balls into a steel hopper. You can treat them like gravel. Harvesting heirlooms is bomb defusal. Amani learned this the hard way. The skins of the brandy wines and the Cherokee purples were so thin they could split from a heavy dew, let alone a clumsy thumb. She had to cut them from the vine with surgical snips, leaving a 1/4 inch of stem intact so the top wouldn't tear. She had to pack them in single layers. If she stacked them, the weight of the top tomato would crush the bottom one into a useless, leaky mess before she even reached the highway. Sleep became a rumor. She woke at 4 in the morning, strapping a headlamp over her sweat-stained baseball cap, and waded into the thick, humid vines. The tomato plants released a sticky, yellow-green resin that coated her forearms and jeans, turning her skin black and smelling sharply of bitter alkaloids. Her fingernails were permanently stained a bruised purple. Her back screamed. She bought 20 more plastic crates, then 50. She maxed out her final emergency credit card to buy a used commercial walk-in cooler from a bankrupt florist, wiring it directly into the barn's aging electrical panel so she could pull the field heat out of the fruit before shipping. By the second week of September, Teddy Marshall wasn't her only client. Chefs talk. They are a paranoid, competitive breed, but they cannot keep a secret when it comes to ingredients. Teddy had put a simple, thick slice of Amani's Cherokee purple on a plate, hit it with flaky sea salt and a drop of olive oil, and charged $18 for it. The local food critics lost their minds. Within days, Amani's phone started ringing. First came the sous chefs from the boutique bistros, then the purchasing managers for the high-end hotel restaurants. They wanted what Teddy had. Amani didn't negotiate. She named a price per pound that made her own stomach drop, a number so high it felt like extortion. Nobody blinked. They just asked for her routing number. She was moving 400 pounds of delicate fruit a week out of the back of her dented Ford. The $14 in her checking account turned into 1,000, then 5,000, then 20,000. The numbers on the ATM screen stopped looking like a mistake and started looking like a weapon. She hired help. She didn't put an ad in the paper. She drove to the county extension office and found 2 brothers, David and Samuel, whose family dairy had gone under the year before. They knew how to work without complaining, and they knew how to keep their mouths shut. She paid them $20 an hour, double the going agricultural rate in the county, cash at the end of every shift. "Don't bruise them," she told the brothers on their first morning, handing them each a pair of sharp pruning snips. "If you drop one, leave it for the crows. If you pack a cracked tomato and I deliver it to the city, the chef will reject the whole crate. Treat them like glass." They waded into the green thicket. The operation scaled from a desperate scramble into a brutal, highly efficient machine. The barn transformed into a makeshift packing house, but with the money came the exposure. You cannot quietly flood the premium regional market with thousands of pounds of top-tier produce without someone tracing the supply chain. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The air was thick and heavy, threatening a late-season thunderstorm. Amani was in the barn, tallying a stack of invoices on a clipboard, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of a resin-stained hand. The crunch of gravel in the driveway made her look up. A black SUV pulled up next to her rusted Ford. It looked exactly like the one from last November, just a newer model. Rafe Graham stepped out. He was still wearing a tailored coat, though the September heat made him look deeply uncomfortable. He didn't look dismissive this time. He looked predatory. He walked up to the open barn doors, his polished shoes crunching against the dirt. He stopped at the threshold, taking in the operation. He saw the walk-in cooler humming loudly. He saw the stacks of neatly organized, single-layer crates glowing with deep purples, vibrant yellows, and streaked greens. "Miss Rogers," Rafe said. His tone was measured, carefully devoid of the arrogance he had carried a year ago. "You've been busy." Amani set her clipboard down on a wooden crate. She didn't walk toward him. She stayed exactly where she was, forcing him to stand in the dusty entrance. "I'm working, Rafe. What do you want?" "I had a very interesting lunch yesterday at the foundry," he said, stepping out of the sun and into the shade of the barn. "I ordered the heirloom salad. It was exceptional. I asked the chef where he sourced his tomatoes. He was reluctant to tell me. But the culinary world is small. I recognized the address." "Glad you enjoyed your lunch," Amani said flatly. "You're trespassing." Rafe offered a thin, calculated smile. "Not exactly. We need to talk about the harvest." "There is no we. Actually, Miss Rogers, there is." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not a clipboard this time. A legal letter. "Valley Processing holds the exclusive right of first refusal for all nightshade crops cultivated on this property. It's a standard clause in the seed and soil amendment contract your father signed." Amani stared at him. The sheer audacity of it made her jaw clench. "You dumped garbage on my land to save a few $1,000s in tipping fees," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "We deposited organic soil amendment," Rafe corrected smoothly, holding up a finger. "And, it appears, a significant quantity of proprietary, unpatented heirloom seed from an aborted product line. Seed that belongs to Valley Processing. Seed that is currently generating a massive, highly profitable yield on land bound by our agricultural contract." He took another step into the barn. "You've done an impressive job harvesting it, Amani. Truly. But that fruit belongs to the cannery. We are prepared to offer you standard processing rates for the tonnage you've collected. 12 cents a pound. We will send trucks tomorrow to collect the remainder of the field." 12 cents a pound. She was selling them for $4 a pound in the city. He wanted to steal her business, crush the delicate fruit into high-end artisanal sauce, and leave her with pennies. Amani didn't scream. She didn't panic. 6 months ago, this man would have terrified her. But she wasn't the desperate, exhausted woman freezing in the mud anymore. She had money in the bank. She had a lawyer on retainer. She picked her clipboard back up. "You should have read the addendum, Rafe," she said quietly. Rafe's smile faltered. "Just a fraction." "There is no addendum." "There is," Amani replied, leaning against the wooden packing table. "When you dumped 17 tons of slurry on my property, you triggered Local Environmental Ordinance 402 regarding industrial biowaste. I didn't report you to the EPA last November because I couldn't afford the surveying fees." She walked slowly toward him. She was covered in dirt, tomato tar, and sweat, but she carried herself like she owned the entire county. "But I can afford them now," she continued. "My lawyer filed the paperwork 3 weeks ago. The moment that slurry hit my soil, it was legally classified as abandoned industrial waste. You forfeited all proprietary rights to the biological material the second it dropped from your truck." Rafe's face tightened. The smooth corporate veneer cracked. "You signed a contract. My father signed a contract for compost." Amani cut him off, her voice cracking like a whip. "You dumped uncomposted, highly acidic, fermenting industrial runoff. You breached your own contract. The seeds grew wild. They're classified as agricultural volunteers. Legally, they belong to the landowner." She stopped 2 feet in front of him. He flinched, stepping back slightly as the sharp, bitter smell of tomato vines rolling off her clothes hit his nose. "If you send a truck to my property tomorrow, I will have the sheriff arrest the driver for trespassing," Amani said, her eyes locked onto his. "If you try to sue me for the fruit, I will countersue Valley Processing for illegal dumping of industrial biowaste. I will drag your company through a 2-year environmental audit that will cost your board of directors millions in legal fees and EPA fines. I will burn your logistics department to the ground." Rafe stared at her. The silence in the barn was absolute, broken only by the loud, steady hum of the walk-in cooler holding $10,000 worth of fruit. He was calculating the risk. He was a numbers man, and the numbers she had just laid out were catastrophic. He looked at the crates of perfect, bruised purple tomatoes. He looked back at the tired, hardened woman standing in front of him. He slowly folded the legal letter and slid it back into his coat pocket. "The board won't appreciate this," he said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "Tell the board to stay off my farm," Amani said. Rafe turned and walked out of the barn. He climbed into his black SUV, started the engine, and drove away. He didn't look back. Amani stood in the doorway and watched the dust settle on the driveway. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline bleeding out of her system. She took a deep, shuddering breath, tasting the dry dirt in the air. "Everything all right, boss?" Amani turned. David, the older of the 2 brothers she had hired, was standing at the edge of the field, holding 2 heavy crates of green zebras. He looked concerned. Amani looked at the crates. She looked at the sprawling, chaotic jungle of green vines that stretched all the way to the county road. "Yeah, David," she said, her hands finally steadying. "Everything is perfectly fine. Put those in the cooler. We have a delivery to make. By the end of October, the first hard frost hit. The temperature plummeted overnight, freezing the water inside the vines. By dawn, the massive green thicket in the south pasture had collapsed into a sea of blackened, dead vegetation. The harvest was officially over. Amani sat at her kitchen table. The house was warm. The furnace, which had been broken for 2 years, was blowing hot air through the vents. She opened her laptop and logged into her business banking account. The screen loaded. She stared at the bold black numbers. $142,500. She had done it. In 5 months, pulling fruit out of a corporate garbage pile, she had cleared 6 figures. She had paid off the farm's back taxes. She had bought out the equipment loans. The deed to the land was sitting in a fireproof lockbox in the hallway, completely unencumbered. She closed the laptop. The business wasn't a fluke anymore. Before the frost killed the vines, she had spent a week fermenting and saving seeds from the strongest, largest, and most flavorful tomatoes. She had thousands of seeds drying on wax paper in the spare bedroom. They were acclimated to her soil. They belonged to her. Next spring, she wouldn't be relying on a chaotic pile of waste. She was going to plow the south pasture properly. She was going to set irrigation lines. She was going to plant 5 solid acres of the ugly, fragile, perfect fruit. Amani stood up, poured herself a cup of black coffee, and walked out onto the front porch. The November wind was biting and cold, smelling of incoming snow. It was the exact same wind that had blown across the farm a year ago, when she thought she had lost everything. She looked out over the frozen, blackened field. It wasn't dead dirt, it was a factory, and it was hers. Sometimes, the very thing designed to bury you becomes the soil you need to grow. Amani didn't just survive corporate greed. She harvested it and sold it back to them at a premium. If you love stories of people fighting back and winning, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the best revenge is massive success. See you in the next one.